So yes, today I am talking about ecosystem services. I think we would be both remiss not to acknowledge that this is a major method that's being used in the field right now, and so it's important to understand how it works and sort of what the basic concepts are. But I'm also going to try and cover what a lot of the sort of inherent issues are with the concept of ecosystem services, because I also think I'd be remiss not to talk about those. It's a lot. Last time I covered this, I had an hour-long class, so forgive me if I talk super fast. So ecosystem services are, in short, the benefits that people derive from nature. There are lots of different ways that that's been described. These are a few of them. One is the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. That was from Daly in 1997, and then the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment defined ecosystem services as the benefits people obtain from ecosystems in 2005. So this is all getting to the same basic idea. Ecosystem services, which are sort of a human-centric concept, are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. There are 4 basic categories of ecosystem services, according to sort of the way most frameworks break them down. This is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments framework. It breaks it down into 4 categories: supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. So provisioning services are sort of what you might think of as stock flows. And so if that's the terminology that you're more familiar with, those are things like timber, food, water for drinking, those kinds of things. Regulating services are the services that sort of provide a stable environment for people to live in. So climate regulation, flood regulation, water purification, these are all regulating services. And then there are cultural services, which are generally the more intangible benefits that people get from nature. So we're talking about aesthetic benefits, cultural benefits, we're talking about mental health benefits. There's a wide array of cultural services. And it's also kind of a catch-all group. So anything that's intangible pretty much gets thrown into cultural services, whether it's really cultural. And then there's supporting services, which underlie all of these services. So those are things like net primary production and nutrient cycling, soil formation. All those things are typically classified as supporting services. There are a number of other frameworks, and they differ from this one, in some sort of not super significant ways. Sometimes they have a couple different services, or they categorize them slightly differently. But this is basically how it's done. So the different services are on your left here, and then the constituents of human well-being that they sort of correspond with are on your right. So there are lots of different constituents of well-being that are served by all of these different kinds of services. And I would argue that this is not even as complex as it actually is, right? There's all these crossing arrows, but actually all of these services are connected to each other as well. So there should be a lot more arrows here. But the basic idea is that all of these are very connected to human well-being. I also want to say ecosystem services, by that language, is a relatively new concept, but this is not like a new thing that people are studying, right? The connections between humans and nature have been studied in all kinds of fields for years and years and years and years, like in anthropology, sociology, in cultural and human geography, in political ecology. There's all kinds of people who've been thinking about this for a long time. For whatever reason, this is the one that sort of made the biggest breakthrough, I think, into the policy arena, and that's why it's gotten a lot of attention. So just to get some language down, there are lots of sort of words that people use interchangeably, but ecosystem services really mean something pretty specific. So you can have an ecosystem out there doing what ecosystems do. That's not an ecosystem service. That's an ecosystem and an ecosystem function. It really only becomes a service when there are people who are benefiting from it. So if you have a forest out there that's sequestering carbon on another planet, there are no people, that's not an ecosystem service. That's just a forest sequestering carbon on some other planet. And we don't have a benefit from that often until there are other forms of capital involved. Sometimes we get a direct benefit from the ecosystem service, but for example, if you have water purification, unless you're going to the river and drinking water, there's all sorts of plumbing, sort of other forms of human capital or other forms of capital that are involved before humans benefit from that. So benefits are also often mediated. And then values, you can have multiple benefits from the same service. And then values are a separate thing from benefits entirely. So that's how we're talking about sort of how we're quantifying those benefits, and that can be in monetary terms or not. So for example, say you do have a forest, and the forest is, the roots of the trees are holding onto the soil, so the ecosystem service there is that so you can say the ecosystem service in that case is preventing erosion, right? And to keep water clean for people, so that you have the benefit is clean drinking water. You might also have the benefit is clean swimming water. Those are two different benefits, and the benefit from clean drinking water might be health. The benefit from clean swimming water might be happiness, right? And you can quantify those things in different ways. Why bother? I think this is somewhat self-evident. So the ecosystem services framework has really been developed as a policy sort of tool to get the value of ecosystems into the policy conversation. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in particular was really designed by and for decision makers. So this is a pragmatic tool, right? The idea is to include ecosystem services in the cost-benefit analyses that policymakers are often doing to make decisions about how they're going to use land. So before you had the ecosystem services concept, this is a diagram of channelizing the Missouri River. That same thing has happened to a lot of rivers all around the world. But before you had the ecosystem services concept, you might think of, okay, well, we've got the benefit from putting in more agriculture and more industry, and we have the cost of channelizing the river, and those are the benefits and costs. But actually, with the ecosystem services concept, you're able to think about what are the costs of channelizing that river in terms of flood mitigation, in terms of carbon storage, in terms of all these different services that support human life, and those all have an economic value. So sort of allowed us to start thinking of it, allowed us, and by us I really mean policymakers, which I'm not, but it allowed people to start thinking about what are the actual trade-offs that are happening here, and put those in sort of apples to apples terms for policymakers. And then I put public awareness up here because I think when people are thinking about ecosystem services, they might be thinking about the environment in different ways than they have in the past. So they may not have been thinking about all the things they don't see that the environment is doing for them, and that maybe can get people more involved in all kinds of environmental actions. But it's pretty complicated, right? So you can't just value all of these ecosystem services. So there are some services that are pretty easy to put in dollar terms, or maybe a little bit easier. Certainly the provisioning services are pretty easy to put in dollar terms and pretty easy to quantify. There are other things that are harder to put in dollar terms but you can still quantify, like carbon storage. Then there's a whole category of services, cultural ecosystem services, which are what I study. They're basically impossible to quantify in an effective way. And when you do, there's a lot of sort of ethical questions about how you're doing that and whether that makes a lot of sense. So this is a very complicated concept, right? Ecosystem services can be very useful, but they're not always the easiest thing to implement if you want to capture a full suite of values that's provided by an ecosystem. And so I'm going to go quickly through one case study of somebody who tried to do this. So this is a study by Derek Vollmer and his colleagues of the benefits, the cultural ecosystem services benefits provided by the Ciliwung River in Jakarta, Indonesia. And what's really interesting for people who study cultural ecosystem services is that they said specifically we focused our research on cultural ecosystem services because it was apparent that these services and their benefits were being overlooked in favor of a plan to maximize flood mitigation. So you can also have these services sort of battling with each other, right? And so sometimes, you know, there's a service that they're trying to provide, in this case by maximizing flood mitigation, but that's going to change the river such that cultural ecosystem services are affected. So there's a lot of sort of tensions between these things as well. And so what they did was they used a number of different methods. They used choice experiments, they did calculate willingness to pay, they also used in-depth interviews, and they did surveys of people. So they had a whole sort of suite of methods to get at what the cultural ecosystem services were of the river for the people living around this river in Jakarta. And what they found was that, first of all, cultural ecosystem services were really super important to people living around the river. It was one of the things that came out the most in their interviews. And so the willingness to pay that they calculated for this was $1.53 that people were willing to pay to maintain green space around the river. And the proposal was, I should clarify, to sort of eliminate the green space to widen the river so that they would be able to better mitigate floods. So for people in that area, that was a fair amount of money. They were willing to pay $1.53 per month to maintain the park space. But they also found, just by talking to people, that about 40% of the households surveyed reported recreating in or along the river. So that's one cultural ecosystem service, recreation. More than half of those households engaged in fishing. That's another one, fishing. And many of them were swimming. So these are all recreation services, despite the poor water quality. And then the bamboo platforms along the river, ostensibly used for domestic chores, also function as social spaces. So you have social capital coming from this as well, which is another cultural ecosystem service. So you've got sort of these two different ways of talking about the services. I think this is really interesting, and if we had more time, it'd be cool to have a discussion about which of these is more convincing, and which sort of what the problems are with talking about services in these two separate ways. But this is sort of a way that you can get at these things. And they were able to bring these to decision makers who were making decisions about how to channelize the river in Jakarta. So again, we're going to quickly get into some of the controversies with the ecosystem services framework, but it's important to recognize that this is a pragmatic tool, right? There are a lot of issues, but it's actually able to come up with information. It allows people to come up with information they can present to policymakers. So you're sort of balancing those two things when thinking about ecosystem services. But like I said, I would be remiss not to talk about a lot of the controversies. So one of the big controversies in ecosystem services is that frequently they're expressed in dollar terms, and a lot of people don't think that that should happen. So I put up quotes from two people who are sort of on opposite sides of this. So one is from Macaulay in 2006. It's a pretty well-known piece that he wrote, but he said, if we mean to make significant and long-lasting gains in conservation, we must strongly assert the primacy of ethics and aesthetics in conservation. We must act quickly to redirect much of the effort now being devoted to the commodification of nature back towards instilling a love for nature in more people. The only successful large-scale ecosystem service-based project yet achieved is the imperiled Catskill watershed, but this nugget might turn out to be fool's gold. And he goes into this article about all of the ways in which monetary valuation can actually sort of come back to bite you in the butt, basically. Like that if you start talking about things in dollar terms, then that's the frame that you're in. And once it becomes not economically profitable to be conserving land, then how do you continue to argue for doing that? And then there was an Indian economist, Sukhdev, in 2012 in an interview with Yale's publication Environment 360, who was saying, well, really though, this is a practical solution. In the frame that we're currently in, this is how we're going to get this in the conversation. He said, it's the challenge of addressing what I call the economic invisibility of nature, because nature provides a hell of a lot to us, whether it's clean air, fresh water, nutrients, and water cycling for agriculture, or whether it's disease prevention or recreation. So there's a lot coming to us for free. These are goods and services which are not market goods and services. They're in the nature of public goods. But the problem is that we're not in a situation of plenty anymore. We've been eating into this capital, so to speak, that's providing us free but valuable services. We use nature because it's valuable, but we lose it because it's free. So he's saying what we talk about is money. And if that's what we're going to be talking about in a policy realm, then we need to be talking about nature in money terms as well, because otherwise it's just not going to be included in the conversation. So that sort of captures the sort of idea of why monetary valuation might be a problem, but there are a lot of reasons that it could be. So one is that the dollar values that ecosystem services are put in are often just way too big for anybody to grapple with. So this is a very famous study from Costanza et al. That team valued the global value of ecosystem services, and the number they came up with was $33 trillion. I don't know what you do with $33 trillion worth of value and how you make any decisions about that. Plus, this was on a global scale, which is very difficult to make decisions about how you're going to manage ecosystems on a global scale. But often you come up with sort of huge numbers for the scale that you're at, and nobody sort of knows how to incorporate those things. And I touched on this already. If you already are talking about money and then it becomes not profitable, if technology advances such that it's actually more cost effective to implement a technological solution, then what do you do if you're already saying that money's the way we're going to decide what we protect? And then some ecosystem services, such as cultural services, are too hard to quantify, and others, like spiritual value, which is another kind of cultural ecosystem service, are probably not ethical to monetize. And then what do you do when you have the last of something? The value of one tree you might be able to come up with, but what do you do when you've got the last tree? What's the value of that tree? It's probably infinite. And then there are inherent market inequalities. So if you put something in dollar values and sort of put it in a market frame, well, the market's designed to allocate things efficiently, not necessarily to allocate things equitably. So you may end up with issues as a result of that. One of the things related to that is that poorer areas, if you're valuing things based on land values, poorer areas tend to be worth less. And then you're saying, well, those people, their ecosystem services are worth less than the ecosystem services for rich people, and that's not really the way we want to be doing things. And then finally, you can have this issue of crowding out. So there's a fair amount of evidence that shows that once you enter a monetary sort of incentive frame with people, it's hard to get them back into intrinsic incentive frame. Oh, and then last but not least, culture. There are plenty of cultures where money is not a primary value. So how do you even talk about monetary values with those people? And then, I'm going to very briefly go over this, but there's a number of people, Peter Brad definitely alluded to this earlier, and he's one of them, who think the whole concept is just destructive. That basically if we are talking about humans as receiving services from nature, that we're just continuing to talk about us as separate from nature, and that historically has been a very destructive frame to be in. So it's too anthropocentric. Reinforces this divide. Doesn't leave room for any intrinsic value of nature. What is the value of nature if it's not providing services to humans? Well, in an ecosystem services frame, there's not really room for that. And then it doesn't ensure protection of other species. There's a fair amount of research showing that biodiversity and ecosystem services overlap in some places, but not in others. So if we protect for ecosystem services, we may still lose a fair amount of biodiversity. And then there are just a lot of ways in which this frame is insufficient. So one is that it can't capture sort of the complex and sometimes all-encompassing nature of the human-environment connection. You know, people have really intense connections to place and where they grew up, and a lot of times those are really intrinsic parts of our identity, and those relationships can be multi-directional, not this sort of unidirectional service-receiving sort of relationship, and as a result, like the ecosystem services frame is just not enough. It just doesn't really capture what that relationship actually is. So a number of thinkers have proposed alternative frames, alternative terms such as Kai Chan proposed relational values. There are other authors who've proposed culturally reflexive stewardship. So there are a number of different ways to sort of capture these multi-directional relationships that people might have with nature. And then again, I come back to, there are a lot of other people who have been thinking about this, and this idea that ecosystem services is insufficient has been emphasized especially by a lot of those people who have been thinking about it for a long time. Given that you know, cultural geographers and feminist political ecologists have been dealing with these issues for many, many decades, decades longer than we've been thinking about things in terms of ecosystem services, maybe there's some wisdom to be learned there.
Great.